everyone. My name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all. Today we are going to be talking about one of everyone's favorite subjects, subspace. And I'm going to say something that might blow your mind. Subspace is not the only kind of subspace. What do I mean by that? Well, we'll have to talk about it a little bit more for me to break down exactly what I mean when I say that phrase. But subspace can come in many, many different forms. And I think generally in the community, we only really focus on one flavor of subspace. And I want to break down what some of the other most common forms of what I'll call alternative subspaces are like, and maybe that might end up being your ticket to finally experiencing some kind of subspace. Or if you have done one of these forms of play before, maybe you've had an experience where you've gone, wait, what the heck was that exactly? And now you're going to figure out what was going on in your brain while you were doing some of these activities. And the three alternative forms of subspace I'm going to be talking about and focusing on today would be Ropespace, Petspace, and Littlespace. And before we get into talking about what these three different variants are, I first want to do a brief overview of what subspace is more generally. And I do have a couple other videos where I've talked about subspace in more detail. If you want to check those out, they are oldies but goodies in my opinion. But what exactly is subspace? And the short definition I like to use for subspace is it is a pronounced altered state of consciousness brought about by consensual BDSM play. And generally speaking, when most people think of subspace, what they are referring to is a state that is commonly brought about by things like pain and impact play. It tends to be something that is linked to, for example, something like an adrenaline rush, or might feel like a runner's high, for example, where you are doing something that is physically and mentally intense, and then by doing it, you are getting into this pronounced altered state of mind. It doesn't always feel like that, and that is not the only thing that can trigger subspace. It can also, for example, feel like what you might feel if you were going through a very deep meditation. Usually people associate this with bottoms and submissives, but tops and doms can also have their own form of spaciness, usually called top space. That tends to more resemble something like a flow state where you are getting very focused on a pleasurable task you were doing, where you could feel like you could keep doing it for hours and hours. You are totally in the rhythm and in the flow of doing that activity, and it brings you a lot of enjoyment to be able to do so. But with subspace, one other term that we can use to help define what subspace is something called transient hypofrontality. And that is a big jumble of sciencey words, but to break it down essentially in plain English, this means when you get to shut off the front of your brain for a little bit. Like if you've ever had that kind of shut down, quiet feeling in your head while doing a scene, you might have been experiencing transient hypofrontality. And this is currently the most clear terminology we have for describing subspace according to scientific literature. Unfortunately, we don't have any good studies about specifically BDSM and transient hyperfrontality that I know of. If that ever does happen, I will be very, very excited. But that is one term you can use in further research if you want to. But as I was saying, the common belief is that subspace is typically linked to things that involve sadomasochism, like pain and impact play. And that feels really limiting. Most of the advice that I have heard of for getting into subspace basically amounts to play harder, take more pain, do longer scenes, and that is not really a possibility for everyone. And frankly, subspace is kind of treated like the big of BDSM. It is the thing you should be reaching for in your scenes. You should be getting into it as often as possible. It is the best thing you can ever experience in kink, is getting into subspace, or top or dom space for that matter. And I think that that is a very limiting view. If you want to be able to experience subspace, but you're constantly being told the way to get there is something that you don't enjoy doing or can't do at a higher level, like that's got to be pretty crappy. So what I want to do instead is I want to defocus this fixation on pain and impact play and sadomasochism, though that is very much a valid part of our community. I don't want to make it seem like the only way you can experience this really amazing, wonderful thing is by only ever engaging in pain or extreme forms of play along those lines. Not to mention, I think this focus on pain and impact play to get to subspace also compounds the existing pressure in the community to do those things, to do them often, to enjoy them, to have that be the center of your BDSM experience. Like, if you go to a dungeon most nights, I would say in my experience, 75+% of people are doing some form of pain and impact play, and it can feel like you need to get with the program, go with the flow, and do that for yourself as well, but you don't have to. And if you have struggled to get into subspace with just getting your partner a cup of coffee or doing a flogging, let's talk about some alternative ways of getting into subspace that are just as equal and just as enjoyable, but have their own unique aspects. And the first one I want to talk about here is called Ropespace. And Ropespace is commonly associated with especially shibari rope bondage, but I would say it can really be done with any kind of bondage. Ropespace, I think, is something that can be a very different experience from maybe more traditional common subspace, where with more mainstream pain-focused subspace with things like impact play, that tends to be something that is very giggly, silly, lots of movement. It can also be very still and very calming, but from my experience at least of it, subspace tends to be a lot more like active and more pronounced, and like there's babbling and talking, and like it feels much more active mentally in my brain too, like just the sensation of it in my brain feels much more active. Whereas with Ropespace, what tends to happen is it feels more like you're floating through the clouds and you're being held in this calm, comfortable, weightless space. It tends to much more resemble that like deep meditation form of subspace as opposed to the more giggly, adrenaline fueled form of subspace, where it feels almost like being in a dream, but you're also still awake at the same time. But Ropespace can be a little bit tricky to get into. Your individual experience of any form of subspace is going to be totally individual. I know for myself, when it comes to getting into Ropespace, I'm not someone that goes into there completely instantly. Like, it takes doing a very certain type of bondage scene for me to get there. Something typically where I am more still, there's not a lot of pain happening, or if it is, it's very evenly distributed. Something more like mummification or like a full body suspension tends to be for me what leads to Ropespace. But for other people, they go into Ropespace the second rope is on them. It is an instant transported into Ropespace thing as soon as they get any rope, any kind of bondage on them. And that obviously can present some problems. And so if you are somebody that wants to explore Ropespace and you haven't done anything with bondage before, be aware of that. I think part of that is mentality and habit. Like, if you get into a comfortable spot doing rope with somebody, you know what to expect, you feel confident in that, I think it makes it more likely that you will get into Ropespace earlier and more often. But it can happen to anyone. You don't have to have any experience at all with kink of any kind to get into subspace, Ropespace, basically anything. And there are people out there that will take advantage of that. I think maybe even more so than in the broader BDSM community. There are people that do rope that are very out and loud about it, and they love doing rope, and they love doing rope with new people. And the reason why they love doing rope with new people is because they know about Ropespace, and they intend to take advantage of that when they are playing alone with somebody. Because when you get into any kind of subspace, there is a tendency to become more agreeable, more pliable, because you feel so amazing, you could do anything, right? You'd want to do anything. You like anything that will keep the sensation going, let's do that. Not everyone gets into that frame of mind, but a lot of people do. That is a risk to be aware of. And so I really recommend, if you want to explore this or you want to see if this can happen for you, play in public, play with somebody you know well and you trust. Do not do this in private alone with somebody, especially when you don't really know them that well. You know, if you're married and you're exploring this, like, that's one thing. But if you're brand new to kink and you're just like meeting somebody online to do rope with, play in public, please. It's really the best thing for your safety, if at all possible. It's also worth mentioning, because Ropespace can be more calm and more floaty, there tends to be other changes to behavior associated with that. For example, it's very, very common to go totally nonverbal during Ropespace. This happens in general Subspace too, but with Ropespace, I think it happens more commonly, where you might get into that state where you really, really want to be able to communicate with your partner that maybe you're flying too high, or you want to come down right now, or whatever else, but you just can't find the words. And so definitely have a plan in place for alternative forms of communication. Have them check in with you. I'll talk about that more in a minute, how you can navigate getting into Subspace and handling that and having those pre-scene communications, but just be aware that it can change your approach. I will also say too, I've talked a lot here about how Ropespace tends to be more floaty and calm and inward, but you can absolutely have Ropespace that is based in pain and challenge and suffering, and a lot of people get into Ropespace that way, where they enjoy having a scene where it's that combination of bondage and loss of control, not being able to fight back, but then also being in a state of experiencing very intense sensation, where you're having this rope dig into your skin, you're in the air, you can't get away, and that can also be what provokes Ropespace for them. And how mentally that feels different than Subspace can vary. And again, all of this is a spectrum where, like, it can be calm, it can be fighty, it can be silly, it can be fun, it can be a bunch of different things. But part of the fun of exploring Subspace is you get to learn what brings on your own unique aspects of Subspace, like what for you is individual to you, what types of scenes bring out different aspects of Subspace for you, and that is all worth keeping track of. I love having a scene journal if you want to do that, especially if you don't play very often. You can keep track of your scenes that way and see what you experience, how you feel, and see what correlates with what feeling. So let's talk a little bit about having a plan in place. Or if you want to explore some kind of Subspace and you're not sure how you might end up feeling or how you want to react, I'd recommend just straight out telling your partner, assuming you trust them, of course, and you should only do this with people you trust. Hey, you know, I haven't really done this before, or I want to do this to try and experience Subspace. If that happens to me, or if it's Ropespace, this is really a general thing to do for any kind of space, whatever happens to look like. I want to try to get to some kind of space, or I might experience that here. If you know already what might happen to you, if you've had it happen before, tell them that. If you don't know anything, you can say, I don't really know what might happen. This is what I think could happen based on my general experiences and scenes, my personality, you know, again, that fighty, silly, if you talk back, if you go totally silent, if you cry, whatever it looks like, communicate that or give them some kind of theory about this is generally in the ballpark of what it might be like. And then have it just be known that you can't know how you're going to react. How often do you want your partner to check in with you? If you go nonverbal, if you stop responding, what do you want them to do next? Do you want the scene to end immediately? Do you want them to take time to slowly ramp it down? Because some people, they don't want to go into Subspace at all. They don't really know how they're going to handle it, so they want out immediately. Or other people, they want to have that slow transition out, and that feels smoother and easier for them mentally to be able to handle. And so make sure you have your bases covered. Talk about where is okay to touch, how long they can touch for, lingering touch versus very brief incidental touch. Talk about what you want to do for aftercare. Talk about in-scene communication and safe word usage. Make sure you have all of that down pat before you do the scene. Now let's talk a little bit about how you can experience Ropespace for yourself and how to make that more likely to happen. And Ropespace, I think, tends to go back to one of the key factors that really is common in all of BDSM, but is especially apparent with rope for whatever reason. It all goes back to connection and having a safe, trusting connection with your partner, even if you know they're going to mess you up, do painful things. If you want that to happen, there still should be a trusting relationship underneath that, but it goes back to connection with your partner. And even if you don't know somebody very well, there are some tools you can use to help you build up a connection, right? You can do shared breathing exercises. You can hold your hand to their chest and vice versa. You can have your foreheads pressed together. You can have other ways of like calm physical connection where you were syncing up together before the scene. You can like touch each other's bodies, or maybe you're both kneeling and they have like their arms on your legs and you have your hands on their knees or whatever else. Like have some kind of way of having that physical connection and just like having some time of like shared breathing, pacing your breathing together, doing a meditation together, things along those lines to establish that connection before you get into doing the scene. You can do things like, you know, they're at the top, they bring out the rope, they gently have the rope go across your skin, maybe drape it around your neck, have it go down your chest, whatever feels comfortable to you and is inside your negotiated boundaries for touch, but have that like connection of like, we're about to do the rope, I'm introducing it, but we're not actually fully doing the rope yet. And that can help you ease into that scene space and help you get more comfortable with what's about to happen without it actually getting into the full-on scene quite yet. You could do something very simple like Ichinawa, which is a one rope technique. You could learn how to bind wrists together, ankles together. You could put on a collar and cuffs. You could use saran wrap. You could use pala wrap. You could do a full body harness that's very simple, like a karate, for example. But there are lots of different ways to get to Ropespace. You don't have to be an expert yet. Have some safety shears, take some classes, take some courses online, and you'll have what you need to be able to start exploring in that direction. And for our next alternative form of subspace, we have one of my personal favorite topics, Petspace. And Petspace is something that I love, but also I have a slightly controversial opinion about it. And the reason for why that is I have a very particular definition of what I consider Petspace to be. What I think the more accurate use of the term Petspace probably is. I'm not the be-all end-all expert. This is simply my opinion. And as you can probably tell from the fact I am talking about this in a video about different types of subspaces, I do think that Petspace is a subtype or derivative of subspace. And it means having a pronounced altered state of mind that you get into through doing pet play. However, I have seen over the years a lot of people use Petspace as a sort of catch-all term for whenever you are in the role of acting like a pet or even like an animal. And it's basically whenever you are role-playing as being a pet, you're meowing, you're woofing, you're doing whatever, congrats, now you are in Petspace. But I think this creates some confusing language, and generally I make a distinction between being in a pet headspace and being in Petspace. Petspace is that pronounced altered state of mind, whereas you can be in pet headspace basically whenever you are consciously acting like the pet you are trying to be. And I think that it's not a radically different change, but I think it does help to make that distinction and make that separation. I think the reason why we have that overlap in terminology is probably because of the fact, at least when I was coming up in the pet play community and these terms are really being kind of fleshed out for the first time in like the broader landscape of kink, a lot of people, most people, did not have access to local communities. They'd never gone to a BDSM event before. They've never taken a class in person. They've never done kink that wasn't pet play. And so they kind of vaguely knew what maybe subspace was. They'd heard of it before, but they didn't really have a frame of reference for what subspace is like or how it's different than just acting like being a submissive. Like, people don't use the term subspace to indicate when they're just acting submissive or when they're following their dominance orders. And so it also doesn't really make sense to use Petspace that way, as though just like acting like a pet is making you go into Petspace. It does for some people, but they're different to me. And so I get why that terminology evolved the way that it did, and maybe I'm just trying to fight the tide uselessly against the ebb and flow of change, but it is what it is. I think that if you want to be more accurate with your language, if you're talking about just like acting like a pet headspace. If it's a pronounced altered state of mind, I'd call it Petspace. And I actually think that Petspace in general is much harder to get into than subspace or Ropespace is. If I had to like order these in terms of like how difficult it is to get into these various headspaces. I would say it would be Ropespace first, then Subspace, then Littlespace, then Petspace. That's how I would order that. It depends person to person, but that's been my broad experience, and also like what I've heard from other people and like how common it is to get into certain forms of headspace. Because when you're getting into Ropespace, your goal is really just to like enjoy the rope experience and have the feelings you want to be having, and then like either get really floaty or be overwhelmed by the loss of control or the amount of pain, whatever it is, and like just float and be still in that. Whereas with Petspace, you are an active participant in making the space happen. Like, as opposed to having rope on you or being spanked and then like processing that internally, maybe like moving around a little bit to process the pain. When you are doing pet play, usually that's a lot of moving, a lot of doing stuff, right? You're chasing a ball or a laser pointer or eating from a bowl or doing tricks. Like, you're being very active, and so it's hard to fully sink into that place of being more instinctual and go with the flow, because you're having to consciously make decisions about your behavior much more actively, like in terms of like, how quickly am I getting the ball? Am I going to bark? Will I eat this food? Am I going to be bratty? Like, there is still a lot of that on brain stuff that makes it difficult to get into a state of transient hypofrontality, because you're having to do a lot of processing. And so it takes a lot more time in terms of trust built up with a partner, the kind of play space you're in, a lot of different factors to get to that comfort level where you can become more instinctual and not consciously think about like, am I going to playfully nibble my partner's hand when they try to take the tennis ball out of my mouth? Like, if you're newer to pet play, that is something you definitely need to think about, because you don't necessarily know the answer to that question or not if you haven't talked about it. But when you get to a higher level of trust in a relationship, if you really know somebody, you can kind of rely on your intuition a little bit more to guide you in the correct direction. And so knowing this, I would say there are two broad different approaches to Petspace that are the most common. I would say the number one way to get into Petspace would be more of that flow state, where you're not having to consciously think about what you're going to do next in every individual action, but everything is so pleasurable and so enjoyable that you can go from one thing to the next, repeating that task over and over again. If you're doing a bunch of different stuff, it's a lot harder to get into that flow state if you're like constantly jumping between like doing this and this and this. But if you're, for example, doing trick training or playing fetch with the tennis ball for long enough, you can get into a flow state doing that, because there's that rhythm, that beat to the activity. Whereas if you're going from like trick training to being in a kennel to like eating a snack to cuddling on the couch to doing this, doing that, like, it's a lot harder to get into flow because you're constantly moving from one state to the other. I think if you are looking at the other second form of Petspace, what you are more likely to see is it's more based in getting fully into the role play. Like, you are getting lost in the role, not necessarily in like a method acting kind of way, but like kind of like you're fully engrossed in that role of being the pet, to the point where like you're not necessarily consciously thinking as like, I'm the human acting like a pet, but now you are kind of acting in the way that you would if you were somewhat, at least, more like the biological animal you're trying to play as. I think the second version is a lot harder to get into because it's more difficult to get fully into that role with how many different things are that much more different being a human versus being an actual pet. I have to say a lot of this is probably biased because of my own experience and relationship to Petspace. Like, 95% of the time I'm doing pet play, I am not in Petspace. I'm consciously thinking, I'm enjoying everything, but I'm not getting into that deeper state of flow or relaxation, and that's fine for me. But in my experience, it is quite difficult to get fully into Petspace, and it is quite fickle. And so I can't really give any like key advice the way I can maybe with like Ropespace for like, here's what you do to make sure Petspace happens. I would say the broad strokes of what's a good idea to do is to make sure the environment is comfortable and safe and calm, minimize outside influences or things that, would trigger you to think about certain things in everyday life, like calendars, clocks, alarms, phones, things like that. If you have something like a TV, maybe have it turned to one of the pet-friendly, have your dog at home during the day and put this on for them, like type channels, have one of those on if you're gonna have anything on the screen, but keep digital distractions to a minimum. Make sure the environment is calm and safe for you, right? You have room to move around and lay down, you know, make sure the furniture gives you space to be able to be your full pet self in, and make sure you feel calm and comfortable being with your partner, because I think that more than anything is probably the number one thing that gets in the way of pet space. Wear things that help you get more into the role you want to play, right? Costuming pieces, role play outfits, wearing a hood, wearing a mask, wearing ears or a tail, things like that. Things that help you feel more like your pet self. Definitely embrace those. Also, if you like sensory deprivation, I think that can really help you get into that more relaxed space more easily. So things like earplugs, for example, or pommets, those can really help you sink into that space and not be taking in so much sensory information that it feels really overwhelming, and that loss of control and bondage can really help people get to the headspace they want to be in. There we go. Much better. All right, let's talk about Littlespace. Now, disclaimer here, Littlespace is the one Subspace derivative that I do not have personal experience with. I do have information here that is from people I know that are littles, that do get into Littlespace, and I am leaning on that knowledge and experience that I have from other people, but it's not my own experience, and I want to make sure that's clear. But I do think that Littlespace is very similar in a lot of ways to Petspace, both in terms of how people get into it, and then also the use of language around it, the confusion between like Little Headspace and Littlespace, if they're different or not. I personally do think they are different in the same way that I think Petspace and Pet Headspace are different. I do think that Littlespace and Little Headspace are different. I think having a specific term that only refers to an altered state of consciousness is important because of the additional level of risk that goes along with getting into an altered state of consciousness that does not exist when what you're doing is more active conscious role playing. But that aside, what makes Littlespace different? And I think what makes it different is obviously Littlespace is what happens if you are doing something like engaging in a CGL or caregiver little dynamic, or acting as a little during a scene, and you get into an altered state of consciousness while acting in that role. And with Littlespace, you really get the best of all worlds here, because you can have Littlespace that is more influenced by traditional impact play type subspace, or more pain-focused subspace where, you know, you're getting punished, you're being a bad little, you know, you're getting a spanking, having that kind of subspace with a little flavor. You can also have it be more like what you see in a lot of Ropespace, where it is more passive and you are having things happening to you, and that is helping you get into your altered state of consciousness. Or it can also be more like Petspace, where you were playing a more active role as opposed to being receptive, and that is allowing you to get into that headspace because of what you are actively doing and actively participating in. And if the little space that you're getting into is more of that active flow type of Littlespace, usually that comes from doing pleasurable activities over an extended period of time, right? So like marathoning your favorite cartoon, or getting really into a coloring book, or doing some kind of repetitive craft activity. It could even be really focusing in on your finger painting and taking hours to make the perfect painting for your caregiver. Or even if you're a little bit more of like an older little, maybe it's really focusing on doing all of those chores your caregiver told you to take care of extremely perfectly, and you're absolutely focused on like loading the dishwasher properly, or like folding your socks properly. And like, I find that to personally be very cute, but it's more of like an active, more flow state where you're doing things. But you can also have Littlespace that is more receptive in nature, where things are happening to you, and that helps you get into that altered state of consciousness. This involves activities that are happening to the little, like maybe it's enjoying the ritual of your partner changing you or putting your clothes on for you. Maybe it's sinking into the bubblegum scented bubble bath that your daddy ran for you, and playing around in the bathtub for hours and just like fully relaxing into that, being taken care of by your partner as they're washing your hair, like scrubbing behind your ears, doing all of that for you. Or maybe it's from the joy you feel when your partner is feeding you by hand and they've got like a jar of applesauce and they're putting it on a little spoon and they're doing the airplane thing and they're putting it in your mouth, and then like you're enjoying that process of losing control, losing authority, being the little and not being big enough to do all that stuff for yourself, but a partner is doing it for you and to you. It could also be about the loss of control, like I mentioned earlier, from something like not being able to stop it if your partner, well, I mean, back up for a second. When I say not able to stop it, I mean in the context of like, you don't have control over it fully, but then like safe words and consent are still very much a thing. Yes, okay, good. Consent, safe words, always good. But I mean in the sense of like loss of control because like your partner is like punishing you for something, they have you over their knee, like are spanking you, things like that where you're like experiencing this intense sensation and you can't fully get away from it, but also you don't really want to get away from it because you actually like it too. So Littlespace can take on many different flavors and forms. And I think if you want to be able to get into Littlespace, it is the same as Petspace, right? The key is creating a safe, calm, trusting environment where you feel secure and not judged by your partner. I think a lot of people, it takes a long time for them to come to terms with their interest in maybe wanting to explore a caregiver little relationship or age play for that matter too, or ABDL, other related kinks that are not necessarily this one, but are, as I said, related to this. Like it can be something that you have to deal with a lot of guilt and shame around. So the last thing you want in your Littlespace environment is to have guilt around it, shame around it, feel embarrassed about what you're doing. You want that support and that praise, and praise kink also as well, both for littles and pets. Just put it on everything, all right? It's your salt and pepper. For a lot of people, at least, not everyone, not everyone's into praise, but for people who are, salt and pepper, put it on everything. It's very positive and can be very helpful because it does a lot to combat that guilt and that shame and fear. At least, unless you're doing praise kink to the point of it being embarrassing and humiliating, in which case it kind of just all ends up going back around then, doesn't it? Kink is a wonderful paradoxical bubble of experiences, is it not? But that's what we love about it, folks. And anyways, with getting more into Littlespace, I think something that people really benefit from is having a concrete area to do their little activities in, be it like a corner of a living room or an independent playroom. Like there's a reason why people spend thousands of dollars making custom-sized adult furniture that's like a crib or like a high chair. Like there's a reason why there's businesses for that. It's because it really helps people get more fully into that role, into that headspace. The same is really for any kind of kink, having a dedicated area for it in your home, in maybe a public play venue, that creates more positive feedback in your head. We're like, we go here, we do this, fun things happen, I can relax here, I feel safe here, and I don't have to worry about life stress while I'm in this space. It's like, it's like having good sleep hygiene kind of, where like you want your bedroom to be an oasis, have your phone away, just relax, you're there to sleep and relax and have positive experiences, not stay up until 4 a.m. thinking about the thing you did that was embarrassing when you were in middle school. And like if you're cultivating a room where you have positive experiences there, more positive experiences and more relaxation are more likely to happen again in the future. Whereas if you get into a state that is more high anxiety, more active thinking, that is more likely to keep going. Does that make sense? I hope it does. And in general, make time for things you normally wouldn't make time for that you like doing, right? Marathon that TV show, make homemade chocolate chip cookies, do that craft project, make that model, play with Legos, do things that you wish you had time for, and then actually set aside time and make time for those things to happen. Just like dump out a whole ton of blocks on the floor and then just like have fun playing with those blocks. Be creative. Don't try to worry so much about making a certain experience happen. Just enjoy the ride, and the destination might end up appearing is basically what I would recommend. And there's one final note that I want to make before we wrap up today, and that is about Subspace and its derivatives happening in public. And especially with Petspace and Littlespace, a lot of people have a tendency to want to do covert pet play or engage in their CGL relationship in public, and to a certain extent, I think as long as it's not like intruding on others. It's not really publicly visible. Like, obviously, if you have a DDOG relationship or CGL relationship, you're going to go into public together at some point. So it's going to happen. But you should be careful. If you find you really easily get into Littlespace or Petspace, and especially if you go nonverbal, you don't really have an easy way to communicate, and you get really lost in it, I do not recommend going out in public and engaging even in, undercover, supposedly trying to be covert pet play or little stuff, simply because that risk of causing a scene in public is going to be quite a lot higher. Everyone these days is looking for a viral moment to have on Twitter or on TikTok, right? They want to be able to take the funny video of the crazy person in public, and I imagine you probably don't want to be that person. So I recommend, just if you get into different headspaces very easily, don't do them in any way in public, and just, try very hard to be able to control that. And if you literally don't have control over your subspace, your little space, your pet space, that is a problem I would maybe recommend looking deeper into, because if you are always losing control very easily, if you simply cannot stop yourself from doing certain things, that is going to lead to problems at some point in the future, whether that be harming yourself on accident, whether that be, pushing your partner too far to do things to you that you want to have happen, that they don't want to have happen. It can be a problem, basically, is what I'm trying to say. But I'm not trying to end this on a dour note by any means. I just want to make sure that people are aware of that, because when subspace hits, it can hit really hard, and you may not necessarily be prepared for what happens as a result afterwards. So hopefully this helped you be more prepared for what to expect from subspace. I hope this helped you figure out some maybe alternative ways of getting into other types of subspace. And yeah, I just want to remind everyone that, like, subspace, bottom space, top space, dom space, this can really happen to anyone on any side of the slash. I am focusing here more on bottoms and subs, but this is an equal opportunity experience, and it can be a little bit harder for doms and tops because they have to be more in control generally during a scene to be able to get into these altered states of mind, but it is perfectly possible. And I would love to hear your thoughts in a comment down below, and especially if you are a pet or a little, what do you think of my separation between headspace versus Littlespace or Petspace? Does that seem useful for you? Does it seem very pedantic? Let me know your thoughts and feelings in a comment down below. If you did enjoy this video already, please do subscribe, because I make videos twice a week about all sorts of different kink and BDSM related topics. And finally, if you want to support what I do, the best you can do that is with Patreon. A link to that will be down below. If you do already support me over there, thank you so much. It means the absolute world to me. And until I see you all next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.